Hello, welcome back to yet another episode of the Super Chonk Show. Today we are looking at something with a specific personality disorder attached to it. This is the Andy Audio Vault X Roseselsa CJ20, and in Andy's very own words,
in fact, if you are not listening to metal or rock music, you might even say that CJ20 is kind of a bit shitty.
this thing might suck for genres that is not specifically rock or metal, which is a wonderful way to introduce an earphone. Not balanced, not musical, not great all-rounder, just a polite warning label, a small threat in audio form. So naturally, because of that, I want to review it immediately. Because once somebody tells me a product is only good for a very specific purpose, my brain decides that this is not a red flag. No, this is now a quest. A deeply unnecessary quest, but a quest all at the same time. So today we are going to go through the CJ20 properly. So let's start things off with an unboxing. The box itself is actually rather well done. On the front you get a render of the earphone, and I have to admit the layout is much cleaner than I expected. The typography is decent, the model just sits on the left, and the whole design really wants you to know that this is a metal earphone with a planar magnetic driver inside. They also mentioned the graphene-plated OCC single crystal copper cable, which is honestly quite a mouthful, but I suppose if you paid for the words, you might as well just print all of it. At the back, you get an exploded view of the earphones, which I always appreciate. It gives the box a bit more personality and makes it feel like the product is trying to explain itself before you even listen to it. There is no graph on the packaging though, which is fine, because I will include that in the sound section below. Once you open the box, you are greeted by yet another flap, and yes, that flap really also wants to educate you about what's going on inside the driver. So you have yet another exploded view. The earphones are on the left and accessories on the right. It's nice. Inside the accessory box, you actually get two set of ear tips, one wider bore and another more standard set. You also get the manual and an easy to open case, which I actually like quite a bit. It is one of those small things that does not sound really exciting, but in real life it kind of matters. There's nothing noble about fighting a case while trying to not drop your earphones onto the floor. So overall, the unboxing is good. It is neat and complete, and it gives you everything you need without feeling cheap or overly dramatic. Next, build quality. The chassis is actually very nicely done. This is a full metal shell and it feels solid without becoming absurdly heavy. The shape is clean, the lines are tidy, and there is a big rounded section of the body that makes it visually obvious where the planar driver is housed. The CJ20 uses a 14.2mm planar magnetic driver, which is still a fairly substantial size. Not the biggest in the world, but large enough to remind you that somebody here had ambitious intentions. What I like most is that the shell feels properly finished. The seams are hidden very well. At a glance, you might even think that there are no seams at all. But if you look closely enough, the seams is there around the faceplate area. It is just very well concealed. This kind of details matter because it makes the product feel more refined in the hand. For me, the fit is also plenty decent. The shape is not doing anything bizarre, and it sits in the ear in a fairly natural way. It is one of those designs that does not beg for attention, which is probably the best compliment you can give to something that is supposed to sit in your ears for hours. There is also a 2-pin termination, which brings us to the cable. Now, the cable on paper sounds very impressive. Graphene-plated OCC single crystal copper with interchangeable terminations, both 3.5mm and 4.4mm included. It is the sort of specification list that sounds like it should arrive with a choir in the background. And to be fair, the interchangeable plug system is genuinely pretty useful. I like that. It adds flexibility without making the whole thing feel annoying. But the cable itself has this cloth-style weave over the conductors, and this is where my enthusiasm starts to quietly pack its bag and leave. Because yes, it does look quite nice. It looks thoughtful even. It looks expensive enough, but actually when you use it, it gets slightly tangly, and once a cable starts doing something like that, I immediately lose emotional interest. So for me, the earphone chassis is pretty well made. The cable is just fine, not awful, not special. Just one of those parts of the experience that exists to test your patience a little bit. Next, sound. Because this is where the CJ20 becomes quite interesting. And by interesting, I mean extremely committed to one idea. This is a very V-shaped tuning, not vaguely V-shaped, not a tasteful U-shape with some energy. No, this thing commits fully. Bass is elevated, mids are pulled back, and treble is pushed up in a way that gives the overall presentation a very aggressive, crunchy kind of tone. And if you are listening to rock or metal, the intent is obvious almost immediately. The CJ20 is trying to give those genres more bite, more attack, more edge, and in that context, I think it actually makes a lot of sense. So talking about bass, the CJ20 is more sub-bass focused than mid-bass focused. Extension is good and the bass delivery has that familiar planar flavor to it. It is quick, it is clean, it's pretty tightly controlled with very little overhang. The sub-bass reaches low and it has that nice rumble to it, but it's not in the sort of bass that spreads warmth all over the mix. This is more disciplined than that. It rises, does the job, and leaves before anybody gets sentimental. That means bass notes sound fast and quite defined. Transients are good, the attack is crisp, and there is very little inertia to slow things down. For rock and metal, this is useful because dense compressed recordings can sometimes feel a bit flat or congested. Here, the CJ20 gives the low end enough force and speed to keep things feeling energetic. It helps kick drums land with intent and it keeps bass lines from becoming a vague smear under everything else. But that said, there is a trade-off. Because the mid-bass is not especially thick or resonant, you do not get the same sense of warmth or fullness that a good dynamic driver can often provide. So while the bass is technically clean and satisfying in a planar sort of way, it does not always give heavier music that extra body that some listeners might want. Personally, I can absolutely hear why this tuning works, but I can also hear why somebody might wish for a bit more lower mid and mid bass weight. The CJ20 sounds fast and controlled, it does not sound especially rich. And that leads us into the mid-range. The mids here are where the personality of the CJ20 becomes both its strength and its limitation. Because the mid-bass is cut back and the upper mids rise, the lower mids do not have much presence or density. Vocals, especially male vocals, can sound a little leaner than ideal. Instruments that rely on body rather than edge can come across slightly hollow. Not broken, not bad, just slightly underfed. That said, clarity is actually quite good. Because the tuning lifts into the upper mids, detail in that region come across very clearly. Guitars have bite, female vocals have presence, and there is enough contrast in the response to make layering fairly easy to follow. The CJ20 does a good job separating elements in a busy mix, and that works especially well for rock arrangements where you want distorted guitars, vocals, cymbals, and drums all competing for the same space without turning into one giant irritating blur. So if you like a more forward, slightly brighter mid presentation, there is a good chance that this will appeal to you. If you prefer fuller, richer, more natural mids, especially vocal-centric music, then the CJ20 may feel a little emotionally distant. It's not that the mids lack clarity, it is that they trade some body for aggression, and whether that works for you depends entirely on what you listen to. Treble is also quite prominent. There is definitely enough energy here to give the CJ20 that exciting, lively top end. Cymbals have shimmer, guitars have crunch, and there is a nice sense of air and openness for the price. Detail retrieval is also pretty respectable as well. It does not feel dull and it does not feel rolled off. In fact, the opposite problem is more likely for some people. And if you are a bit treble sensitive, this may push a bit too far. On certain tracks, the upper range can flirt with sharpness, and depending on your source material and tolerance, you may find it slightly sibilant. For me, it stays mostly acceptable, but it is definitely not a relaxed tuning. This is not a earphone that sits quietly in the corner and let music happen. It drags the music under a harsh ceiling light and asks you to deal with it. Now, in terms of technicalities, the CJ20 is actually pretty decent. Resolution is solid for the price bracket and it performs about where I would expect a competent planar to perform. Imaging is good, instruments placement is quite easy to pick out, and the soundstage is respectable. It is not enormous, but it does not feel cramped either. Width and height are decent, depth is actually fairly good, and that helps with the overall presentation feel more layered than flat. Dynamics are interesting here too. Even though the mid-bass is not especially full, the sub-bass emphasis and upper mid energy do create a sense of contrast. So the CJ20 does not sound dead. It sounds lively, it sounds eager, it sounds like you drank too much coffee and then suddenly decided your playlist was now its problem. As for genre matching, I do agree with Andy's original take. For rock and metal, this makes a lot of sense. The elevated bass, cut mids and boosted treble all comes together in a way that makes guitar sound aggressive, drum sounds punchy, and the overall presentation feeling really rather energetic. This tuning complements those genres very naturally. For pop or any other genres, and basically for more general listening, it is still usable. It's not like the CJ20 suddenly just collapsed into dust the moment you play something less aggressive. But the thinner lower mids and brighter lead do make it feel less natural and less versatile than a more balanced alternative. So yes, it does work outside rock and metal, it just stopped feeling especially ideal. And next up, some comparison. So I'm going to compare it to the 7Hz Timeless 2. Now the Timeless 2 come across as the more all-rounder kind of planar. It is more flexible, more genre agnostic and easier to recommend if you want one set that can do a bit of everything. The CJ20 is not really trying to be that. It is more specialized, it leans harder into a particular flavor, and if that flavor matches your library, it will probably be the more exciting listen. If it does not, then the 7Hz Timeless 2 makes more sense. So overall, where do I land on the CJ20? I think this is a specialist IEM, a fun one, a competent one, and in the right context, a very enjoyable one as well. Technical performance is above average for its class, its build is good, and the tuning has a clear identity. But this is not a universal recommendation, and I do not think that it is actually even trying to be one. So if your library leans heavily into rock and metal, then the CJ20 is actually a pretty compelling option. If you want something broader, fuller, and easier to live with across every genre, then you may want to look somewhere else. The final rating for me is that this gets a strong B, not because it lacks character, if anything it has too much character, but at least it knows what it wants to be, which is more than I can say for most people. Anyways, this is it for this week's episode of the Super Super Audio Show. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Thanks for watching. If you like the content so far, please press the like and subscribe button down below. Thank you so much. I'll see you all in the next one.